Good evening, visitors, and welcome to the Australian War Memorial's last post ceremony. My name is Gerard Pratt, and joining us today from the Royal Australian Air Force is Warrant Officer Gerard Goff. Today marks the commencement of a new sitting year for the 47th Parliament of Australia. We pause here in the commemorative area of the Australian War Memorial and reflect on the freedoms afforded to us as Australians. Freedoms underpinned by those who serve and those who have served our nation in the Australian Defence Force. At the opposite end of Anzac Parade from the Parliament, this institution and the stories it tells reminds us of what it means to be Australian, committed to one another and to this nation. Here with us this evening are the men and women elected by Australians to make the decisions that build and protect our nation, including the deployment of members of the Australian Defence Force across the globe. The roll of honour cloaking us reminds us of the cost of those decisions, as does the physical and emotional toll on those who have served. As the members of Parliament commence the sitting period, your presence here speaks to every Australian of the deep responsibility to never forget individual sacrifices made in our name, devotion to duty and our country. We're honoured to acknowledge the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Australia, the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition, and all members and senators of the 47th Parliament of Australia who are joining us here this evening. We're also honoured to acknowledge General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force, members of the Australian Defence Force, Brigadier Philip Winter, representing the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia, the Honourable Kim Beazley, Chair of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. As always, we welcome the veterans who have served, those that are still serving, and the families that love and support them. The live stream of this ceremony is made possible by the Returned and Services League of Australia and the RSL and Services Clubs Association. We welcome the members who are watching the broadcast of this ceremony from across Australia. During this evening's ceremony, wreaths will be laid at the base of the pool of reflection by guests to the memorial. Australia's Federation Guard is the tri-service ceremonial unit of the Australian Defence Force. They provide a ceremonial presence at civil and military events and during visits to Australia by foreign dignitaries. The Guard will now dismount the catafalque party from the tomb of the unknown Australian soldier. I would now like to invite the Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, to the lectern.
I'd like to acknowledge the members of the Australian Defence Force, including the Chief of the Defence Force, General Campbell, and other serving members and veterans of the Defence Force who are joining us here this evening. I want to also acknowledge the RSL and the leadership of the Australian War Memorial, including Matt Adamson and, of course, Kim Beazley. My federal parliamentary colleagues, members and senators, I thank you for your attendance here this evening, and members of the general public as well. It is good that you are part of what is an important component now and an essential component of the beginning of a parliamentary year in our great democracy, an institution which those who've worn our uniform defend. We gather in this solemn place and we gather in peace. Peace is not a given. For many across the world right now, it is tragically elusive. We do not take peace for granted. The peace that we gather in here today is a gift to us from generations of Australians who have taken up arms in our name. It is a peace shared now with the places where so many of them fell. Beaches where the waves roll in the sea's eternal rhythm. Meadows of flower and birdsong. Places where there is little to hint at the killing fields they once were. Yet they are mapped out in our hearts in an atlas of loss and sacrifice. Places where mud and dust, jungle and ocean, even though they were, at times, their courage was almost beyond our comprehension. But we also remember their fear, the fear of young Australians far from home, confronting the unimaginable as it became reality. We acknowledge the extraordinariness of what they did, but they were human beings of flesh and blood. We remember them. Every name, every face, every future changed forever. Every future lost. We remember all who served in our name and all who serve now. The great multitudes who were cast into the ranks of the unknown soldier as they were torn from life, and those whose families were afforded that one slender consolation of knowing their earthly remains had been identified and conveyed to their final rest. Just one was Private Robert Edward McIntyre, a butcher from Horsham in Victoria. As the marker on his grave at Gallipoli tells us, he served in the 8th Battalion Australian Infantry. Even the bare bones of what is carved into his tombstone is enough to make you pause. His life ended on the 7th of August 1915, barely 4 months into the Gallipoli campaign. He was just 22. But then you come to a solitary line, a message from his parents. How much of love and light and joy is buried with our darling boy. An entire eulogy in just 14 powerful words. The story of war is often painted on a large canvas, in broad brushstrokes of generals and battles, leaders and campaigns, the dead drawn together in a haze of numbers. And so often it is framed in the rhetoric of nobility and sacrifice, lit up with the abiding resilience of the national spirit. But how much of our national spirit is to be found on those modest tombstones like Private McIntyre's? The scale of what Australia lost spelt out in expressions of grief and tenderness. Personal universes of life and love and loss captured in the spare eloquence of a broken heart. It's captured in diary entries and in letters of reassurance and love to those at home. Scraps of paper alive with voices laconic, lyrical, and plain-spoken alike. Each year as we gather in this place of memory, we strive to hear their voices still. We gather amid all these names, arrayed in constellations of grief that never fade and never set. All who went in our name and never came home. Those who came home but were unable to escape the shadow of what they'd seen. And those who went to war and, having seen the worst that humanity is capable of, were forever guided by a sense that despite everything, the best of humanity is inextinguishable. We have seen what horrors Australians have defeated. We have seen the difference Australians have made in the world and the difference they continue to make. We thank all serving members of the ADF. We thank all veterans. Just as they stepped up for us, we must step up for them. As we await the going down of the sun, we thank and pay tribute to them all. We have faced moments when the light has seemed so very far away, but because of them, it is only nightfall that can ever gather us in darkness, lest we forget.
Thank you, Prime Minister. I now invite the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Opposition, to deliver his remarks.
Prime Minister, Chairman of the Australian War Memorial Council Kim Beazley, Director of the Australian War Memorial Matt Anderson, Chief of the Defence Force General Angus Campbell, VCDF Vice Admiral David Johnston, Chief of Navy, Chief of Army, all of those men and women in uniform today, those veterans who have served our country with great distinction. I also acknowledge today those family members who are here to support the memory of their loved ones, and to members of the Parliament who are here to show their respect on this very important day. I'm going to tell you about 6 Australians. Edward Butler was born in Hobart, Tasmania. He worked as a solicitor and was a first-class cricketer. In August of 1916, the second lieutenant was on the Western Front during the Battle of the Somme. A shell explosion saw him lose his left leg below the knee. Edward died of his injuries on that day. Alan Schmidt was born in Canberra in South Australia. He was a labourer when he enlisted into the Royal Australian Navy. In November of 1941, the cruiser on which the ordinary seaman was serving was suddenly attacked. He was one of 645 souls who went down with HMAS Sydney. He was 18 years of age. Donald Robertson was born in Melbourne, Victoria. He was the dux of his year at the Point Cook Air College and was awarded the Sword of Honour. In May of 1952, the pilot officer was on a mission over Korea. His Meteor fighter was making a low-altitude rocket attack when it was hit by ground fire and crashed. Donald's body could not be recovered. Cecil Anderson was born in the Gums in Queensland, and by the time of the Malayan emergency, the former station hand who served in the Second World War and in the Korean War was now a sergeant. In March of 1956, his patrol was ambushed and fired upon as they discovered an enemy hideout. Despite being shot in the chest, the sergeant provided covering fire and calmly gave orders. Cecil soon succumbed to his wounds and was the first Australian to be killed in action in Malaya. Paul Manning was born in Newcastle, New South Wales. He was a gifted rugby player, trained as a police cadet before joining the Australian Army. In March of 1971, his company was in a defensive position in Phuoc Toi province in Vietnam. The pitch black of night was all lit up by the Viet Cong gunfire and satchel charges. The 22-year-old Paul was shot in the neck and killed. Todd Langley was born in Margaret River in Western Australia, and even from a young age he was fascinated with world affairs. He enlisted into the Australian Army in 1993 and trained and served as a commando. In July of 2011, on his 5th tour of Afghanistan, the sergeant was shot and killed by insurgents. Todd was not just a soldier's soldier, he was a devoted husband and father. Ladies and gentlemen, 6 unique Australians from our 6 different states who each saw action and lost their lives in 6 separate conflicts stretched across our history since Federation. And yet they share many common traits. They all chose to serve. They all chose to take a stand against the threats of their times, against imperialism, against expansionism, against ideology, against terrorism and against evil. They all chose to risk their lives in the hope that their individual deeds would contribute to a cause greater than themselves. These 6 Australians are among the more than 103,000 commemorated in this National War Memorial, our most sacred place. And every Australian today is a beneficiary of their collective service and sacrifice. Our remembrance of our fallen is much more than an expression of gratitude. Our remembrance of our fallen reminds us that we too have a choice. In our times of resurgent autocrats and emboldened terrorists who threaten free nations, free peoples and our civilisation itself, it is indeed a time for choosing. May we choose to rise to the challenges of our times and in the process find new national resolve, new national confidence, new national industriousness and renewed national unity. May we choose to stand with our allies in their hour of need, for who will stand with us in our needful hour if we are content to sit on the sidelines. May we choose to inject much needed speed into building and acquiring defence platforms and munitions, respecting history's lessons of peace through strength. May we choose to recall those words of warning which Ronald Reagan spoke to his generation about the price of failure, that history will record with the greatest astonishment that those who had the most to lose did the least to prevent it happening. So may we choose necessary action over futile procrastination to preserve and pass on rather than squander what has been gifted to us through the service and sacrifice of those here commemorated, lest we forget.
Thank you, Mr. Dutton. If you're able, please stand and join in singing the National Anthem.
Australians, all let us rejoice, for we are one and free. With golden soil
For those able, please be seated. The Australian War Memorial was the vision of Charles Bean, Australia's First World War official historian. Bean landed with the Australian troops on Gallipoli and stayed with them at the front through until the end of the war. The idea of this national memorial and museum came to him at Pozières, France, in the depths of the bloody fighting of 1916. Bean's idea was that this would be a place where families and friends could mourn loved ones buried in faraway places. It would also be a place that could help all Australians understand what these men and women had endured and what they had done for us. Bean's vision, to which we remain true, is best expressed as inscribed in the entrance to the memorial's galleries. Here is their spirit, in the heart of the land they loved, and here we guard the record which they themselves made. Tonight, we will read the story behind just one of those on the Roll of Honour, which lists the names of more than 103,000 men and women who have given their lives for us in war and on operations for more than a century. But first, we present a lament, Flowers of the Forest. Wreaths or floral tributes will now be laid at the base of the pool of reflection. The Honourable Anthony Albanese, Prime Minister of Australia, and the Honourable Peter Dutton, Leader of the Federal Opposition. Senator, the Honourable Sue Lyons, President of the Senate, and the Honourable Milton Dick, Speaker of the House of Representatives. The Honourable Richard Marles, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Defence, and the Honourable Andrew Hastie, Shadow Minister for Defence. The Honourable Matt Keogh, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel, and the Honourable Barnaby Joyce, Shadow Minister for Veterans Affairs. The Honourable Pat Conroy, Minister for Defence Industry, and Mr Andrew Wallace, representing the Shadow Minister for Defence Industry and Shadow Minister for Defence Personnel. The Honourable Matt Thistleswaite, Assistant Minister for Defence and Assistant Minister for Veterans Affairs, and Mr Philip Thompson, Shadow Assistant Minister for Defence. General Angus Campbell, Chief of the Defence Force, and Brigadier Philip Winter, representing the National President of the Returned and Services League of Australia. The Honourable Kim Beazley, Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial, and Mr Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial. And the final wreaths this evening will now be laid by visitors to the memorial.
Today, we remember and pay tribute to Private Frank Noel McGowen. Frank McGowen was born on the 18th of March, 1895 in the Sydney suburb of Redfern, the youngest of 8 children born to James McGowen, the first Labor Premier of New South Wales, and his wife, prominent suffragette Emily Towner. Frank received his education at Cleveland Street Superior Public School in Sydney, before going on to study at Hawkesbury Agricultural College in Richmond. He was an active member of the local militia and a keen cricket player. Frank McGowen was 19 years old when the First World War broke out in 1914. He joined the rush of young men seeking to enlist, joining the Australian Imperial Force on the 24th of August 1914, alongside 20 of his college friends. He was assigned to the 1st Australian Light Horse Field Ambulance with the rank of private and began a short period of training in Australia. He embarked for active service from Sydney 2 months later, sailing on board the troop ship Southern. He arrived in Egypt in early December 1914, setting up camp with his unit outside Heliopolis. He continued training alongside his comrades until April 1915, when he began working on hospital ships evacuating the sick and wounded from the Gallipoli Peninsula. Eager to reach the action, McGowen and 3 of his friends jumped from one of the hospital ships off the coast of Gallipoli and attempted to swim to shore. The group was eventually arrested and sent back to the hospital ship. McGowen later wrote to his mother, "There is no disgrace in a soldier being arrested under these circumstances." Private McGowen spent the months which followed making trips to Lemnos, Gallipoli and Alexandria. McGowen landed on Gallipoli in August 1915. During the height of the Allied attacks on Stary Bar Ridge, McGowen and his comrades established a dressing station at nearby Chalak Deir, where they continued treating the wounded. On the 8th of August 1915, McGowen and his comrades rushed to no man's land to provide aid to men wounded by an exploding shell. As they tended to the wounded, a shell hit their position, badly wounding McGowen and several others. Suffering from multiple shrapnel wounds to his back and spinal injuries, McGowen was evacuated to Egypt and admitted to hospital in Alexandria. His condition gradually worsened until he succumbed to his wounds and died on the 24th of August 1915, a year after he had joined the AIF. Private McGowen was buried the following day at Chatby War Cemetery, where his remains lie today, beneath the simple inscription chosen by his grieving family. Someday we'll understand. Private Frank McGowen was 20 years old. His name is listed on the Roll of Honour on my right, among almost 62,000 Australians who died while serving in the First World War. His photograph is displayed today by the Pool of Reflection. This is but one of the many stories of service and sacrifice told here at the Australian War Memorial. We now remember Private Frank Noel McGowen, who gave his life for us, for our freedoms, and in the hope of a better world.
If able, please stand for the reading of the Ode and the sounding of the last post.
They shall grow not old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun, and in the morning, we will remember them.
We will remember them.
Rebel Party, present all.
lest we forget.
Lest we forget.
Catapult party in words, turn. Catapult party, quick, march.
We leave you this evening with the words of the memorial's founder, Charles Bean. Many a man lying out there at Pozières, or in the low scrub at Gallipoli, with his poor, tired senses barely working through the fever of his brain, has thought in his last moments, well, it's over. But in Australia, they will be proud of this. Ladies and gentlemen, girls and boys, that concludes the last post ceremony. On behalf of the Chairman, Director, staff and volunteers, thank you for visiting the Australian War Memorial today and for your continued support of the Memorial's development project. We wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you.